Hi, here's May, and in today's video I'll share my step-by-step art process with you. Seeing this from other artists has been very helpful to me since I was able to pick up a few things here and build and refine my own process from this. Before starting to draw, I first think about what I want to draw and gather references accordingly. This makes sure I limit the time I have to second guess myself and search new references as I draw later on. For each one of these steps, I first explain it in a general way, then how I specifically applied it in the illustration. Here I saw this pose reference on Pinterest and knew I wanted to draw Zhongli in the pose I saw there. That was my starting point for the references. As I thought more about this, I also got the idea to draw him in his archon and not his in-game outfit. I really like the white color and how it contrasts with his dark hair. I've also never drawn this outfit for him, so I looked forward to this experience. Next, let's start with actually drawing. Here I'd like to mention that I myself like to use a predetermined folder structure. Over time I came up with this, and here I'll show the current version I use. Through the folder structure I'm able to draw in a down-to-up way, going through the layers. I like to focus on one part at a time here. Now let's start with talking about the sketching phase. Here is the brush and folder structure I use for this. For me, this is all about determining where different elements will be and getting the proportions or the facial expression of the character down. At times I also make a value thumbnail here when the elements are blocked in, which helps me to get a better idea of if the idea works, whether I should rearrange some elements or what lighting setup to use. For this illustration I started with sketching the pose from the reference. After this I added Zhongli's face and hair, then I drew in his original in-game outfit at first and the archon outfit afterwards. Blocking in the values after this helped me to determine that I would prefer going with this outfit for the final illustration, as this added more contrast because of the white tones. I also sketched in a basic background and a geocube, which I also paid attention to when blocking in the values. Here I added some more dynamic elements, focusing on the composition and flow of the overall image. After this I moved on to the line art. Here would be the brush and folder structure I use for this. I go through my line art layers, drawing over my sketch, starting with the head and ending with the outfit. I tend to overall start with the head for characters I draw. First I sketch the face, then I add hair on top, then I move on to the body, and similarly to adding the hair on the head, I add the outfit for this after drawing in the body. I start with bigger shapes and end with accessoires for this. Usually, if the outfit includes patterns, I'll end with this most of the time as well. And with patterns I mean parts that I don't outline, I just paint these in as shapes and later on use a clipping layer to add colors for these. While I always tend to draw in the full head and body, even if part will be covered up by hair and clothes, during the sketching phase I only focus on the parts that will be visible in the final illustration when I draw my line art afterwards. I do this because, as I mentioned before in the sketching phase, I'm focused on getting the proportions to work, and for me it helps a lot to see this full head and body when I'm determining whether the full head angle and pose of the character I'm drawing work. Back to the line art, I make the silhouette lines and bigger outlines thicker while keeping detail and inner lines thinner. This helps with creating more of a visual hierarchy within the illustration. When I'm done with the line art, I duplicate my line art folder a bunch of times, and like this I'm able to fill in the flat colors using the magic wand selection tool. At times there will also be some empty spaces I have to paint in manually at first. As I'm filling in these colors, I don't pay as much attention to the colors looking accurate, since I tend to adjust some of them after filling in all colors either way. Once again, I go through my color layer in a bottom to top way. Here for Zhongli I also included some gradients for the base color of the arms and the hair. In this process here I then filled in the background with basic shapes. When I'm working on an illustration with a more detailed background, this could happen at many times during the whole process. Sometimes I want to finish the whole character before painting in the background. At other times I'll do this before adding line art for the character, or I'll do it at this stage. To block in the background, I tend to use the lasso selection tool, which creates some sharp edges for things like buildings or, in this case, rocks, whereas for the sky and clouds or other organic elements like plants, I can also just paint them in. But most of the time I would start with lasso selected shapes, since I can use more limited colors for the different shapes and don't have to worry about the transitions. That's also what I did for the clouds here. Adding in more texture would be something I do later on. I chose a few warmer and cooler brownish tones and used these as a base for the background. Next I moved on to shading. For this, using the value block-in I created earlier on, if I have one, or first blocking in the lighting is very useful to me. I tend to export this as an image, adding this to my reference board. Then I start shading. Here would be the brushes and layer system I use for this. Once again, I'm going through my color layers in a bottom to top way. Since the skin, eyes and hair are at the lowest place within the folder, I also still use the principle with focusing on the head of the character first, which tends to be the focal point of the character most of the time. Like this, I have the most focus left as I'm painting in shadows here, whereas for the outfit I may then lose a bit of focus, but often I find not as detailed shading for the outfit helps to draw more attention to the character's face, and due to this it works out to me. The shading process, how much I use the lasso selection tool or how many shadows I paint in, how many colors I use, whether I add a saturated shadow border and so on can be different for each illustration. The shading tends to be more intuitive to me. My block-in usually gives me an outline of where the shadows should be, but not how exactly they should look. I usually start with one shadow color, which would be the base color, more shifted towards purple and slightly darker and more saturated. After this, I can add more layers to add more variation. For the skin, eyes and hair, you'll see I also have a predefined layer structure, but for the eyes and hair, I don't use all these layers most of the time, since I found I prefer going with different layers to portray the shadows, depending on the illustration and character I'm drawing. After going through all the layers, I then often also add a few layers where I paint over all my color layers on top to adjust some colors and values. A highlight outline around the body, rim, light, or an additional shadow layer I want to be on top of all colors would also be something I could add here. Brushes I would use to shade would be a hard round brush with varying opacity and line thickness, but no texture. Then I also use a blender, brush and airbrush at times. Here are a few principles I keep in mind during the shading process. I start with painting in big shapes and then add smaller ones or add shadow transitions. I think about the shadows in these separate ways. First we have ambient occlusion shadows. These portray the form and tend to be added around the outline of the arms, torso and so on. Next would be fold shadows, which only apply to the clothes. It's kind of similar with hair strand shadows in a way. These would be the shadows that are dependent on the material of the part that's shaded. And finally we'd have cast shadows. These are depending on the lighting setup. For one, the distance of the object that casts the shadows, such as the neck or a hand, can influence the intensity and edge of the shadow. The closer a shadow casting object is, the harsher and more intense, and with that darker the shadow is. If an object that's casting a shadow is further away, it would have a less intense shadow with a more blurry edge. The lighting direction then determines the placement of the shadow, and the lighting color the shadow color. Another thing to consider here would be that elements such as anatomy, folds or hair strands could be portrayed through lines or shading. This depends on stylistic preference. Next would be that if you want to add shadows with more hue variation, it can be a good idea to add cool and warm shadow colors. Moving on to highlights. During the shading phase, I would add these for gold or shiny materials and hair. To draw more attention to the face, the last aspect I would mention for shading is adding shadow or light on it. Often I do this on the nose, or here in this case we have the triangular light below the left eye. Now it's time to move on to the background of this illustration and how I draw backgrounds in general. Some general things here would be, I usually don't outline parts in the background but rather paint in shapes. Like this, the outlined character is put more into focus. I've also observed that that's how many backgrounds in anime illustrations and anime are portrayed, which is another reason why I do this most of the time. Similarly to the different colors for the character, I start with a base and then add shadow or texture layers on top. For the different parts of the background, I keep this in mind. The texture of the object. Stones will have a different texture from wood or water, for example. To draw these, I use references for these elements. These also inform you more about how lights or shadows would affect the object, which is also important to consider other than the texture. Then I also ask myself, does the element not take away attention from the character? Like this, I make sure the background elements are not too detailed and that they don't have too much saturation or contrast compared to the character. In an illustration where the character has least contrast and saturation while the background has more, this can also be the other way around. Since I tend to focus on the character, I in general make sure the background elements frame the character. I like to use them to create flow within the illustration. Since I don't paint in backgrounds that often, I don't have go-to brushes when it comes to adding textures. So here I first tried out some different ones and then settled on a few for painting in the clouds and the rocks. I find texture brushes can help a lot with painting backgrounds in general, so determining some go-to ones can be very useful if you want to focus on this. I recommend staying more zoomed out, especially at the start and most of the time while painting in the background here, since you don't want to get lost in drawing details that won't be that visible on the end. I also added more saturation for the clouds surrounding Zhongli, so he would be framed through the background. Since clouds and rocks can take on many shapes, I paid attention to using this to create flow around him as well. After I had drawn in the clouds and rocks, I then also added the smaller elements in the front surrounding Zhongli. Here I went with a geocube and different stones. I placed them in a circular way around Zhongli, again adding some flow to the illustration and framing Zhongli. With all elements added, it's time to move on to the last stage for the illustration, adjusting and adding effects. Here I tend to add filter masks. Often this would include a HSV, hue saturation value, and curves 1. I often turn the illustration black and white here again to check the values. For the background, I then usually add a grain texture. At times also for the character, if I do, I still make sure the background has some more texture, like this more attention would still be drawn to the character. Other than this, I duplicate and merge my character layers to be able to easily adjust this. I then often use Liquify to adjust some proportions, or I may add some clipping groups or filter masks as well. In the illustration of Zhongli, I also added some motion and lens blur to the stones in the foreground to show that they would be in movement. I painted over some parts, used Liquify a bunch of times, and like this the illustration would be finished. Important to note for the adjustment stage is that I tend to come back to an illustration after around a week to first critique it and then adjust it a bit more. I leave some time where I don't look at the illustration to be able to get a new perspective on the whole piece. Speaking of the timing, I now share when I do all the steps. I intentionally split up the time I work on each illustration into different days to be able to adjust the thumbnail, the sketch and the line art before I move on to either the sketch, line art or the coloring. On day 1 I would draw in a thumbnail, including the body of the character where I mark the anatomy. On day 2 I would first adjust this and then sketch the character. On day 3 I adjust the sketch and draw the line art. On day 4 I adjust the line art, fill in the colors, and sometimes I also start shading here. Day 5 and other future days would then be for shading and the final stages. A blocking of the full background or drawing in the full background can happen at different stages during the process here as mentioned before. I often have multiple illustrations at different stages due to this, so I can sketch thumbnails, sketch in general, draw some line art, fill in colors and shade each day. If you're interested in hearing me talk about when I do what during the day and how I use routines, you can let me know in the comments. And that would be it for the steps I take to create illustrations. If you're interested in seeing the longer process video of drawing this illustration, you'll be able to find it on my Patreon. I'll also upload the full resolution there. I hope hearing me explain the steps I take was helpful and inspiring to you. If you want to leave your favorite learnings from this video or your own advice on steps you take in the comments. Thanks for watching, bye!